Hello everyone, a question and answer video today from a comment under the spread of mercenary companies late 13th, early 14th century video, which is actually two questions. As the user says, so 1. How and from where were commoners recruited? Were they of the agricultural population, and if serfs, would their participation in foreign campaigns violate their bond to their lord? 2. Likewise, for knights and other nobility, how was participation in a mercenary company reconciled with their obligations as vassals? Did the organizers of mercenary companies negotiate contracts with recruits' lords by, for example, directing a portion of the proceeds to said lords? So these are very interesting questions, and while I have answered in some videos of this kind, especially about wages, military service, things like that, if you search in medieval warfare playlist, you're gonna find that. But I avow it's they're not under any more specific playlist, and probably have to sort out something for them. And in any case, the questions I will answer them. First of all, taking in consideration, generally speaking, the period of the video, but the question is more general, so we can easily space also in the other time periods, because the questions are in fact generic enough to afford that, but they do touch important aspects of medieval politics and society aside from the merely military one. In fact, first of all, how and from where were commoners recruited, right? So, generally speaking, pretty much everywhere in the world, the commoners, so freemen, who made up the majority, fundamentally, of the population, weren't considered aristocracy, albeit in the original sense of the of freemen. They were considered noble. This is interesting and kind of overlooked as a perspective, both in the Roman or Germanic military system. Every freeman was such because he owned his share of imperium, right? And this is the reason why they had the duty, but also the privilege, to participate to the army when called, right? Because first of all, they actually always were armed. Mm-hmm. So this late medieval times, things had importantly changed because the commoners at large had been, if not disarmed properly, but fundamentally depending on some greater force. It could be, in fact, a feudal lord, a commune, etc. Albeit retaining, in fact, their militias, right, as they were owed since the beginning. In Romano-Germanic tradition, there was the general levy called the ban, that for which, in theory, every able-bodied freeman was eligible for military service. And since the very beginning of this practice, of course, just a part of them, a minority one, most of the cases, usually 1/3, it was already actually very much, was called to arms, with the rest of the community essentially paying for their armament and supplies, right? And this is also pretty theoretical, because even if you look at Carolingian times, and even before, what you realize is that the lords were somewhat hegemonizing the supply and armament system, simply because it was easier. In fact, the same rota system equated to this within the same communities that were made up of commoners, yes, but factually it was kind of a chieftain, a village leader, some kind of upper class and clans that hegemonized the thing. And this is obvious. I mean, it's imperially speaking, but not even that much what we could call statal, right? In fact, I'm pretty triggered by, when modernists, especially, not even contemporaries, actually do this, because they don't even care about the Middle Ages, of course, and they skip the problem altogether, that there was no state before the modern age, and, Western European, in fact, importantly, centralized systems, as they were starting to become, at least at that point, by in fact a modern standard, but something like war, and so gigantic efforts that require an enormous amount of work, of calories if you want, must be engineered, must be organized, administered in ways that require some kind of specialization and hierarchy and discipline and authority and control. And the rota system naturally was designed not to make everybody go at war at once, so that somebody would remain home salvaging the harvest for the next season, for others to go at war, right? And this thing eventually took ever more important forms, where with some kind of almost functionalization of certain specific clans or families by status to be the military ones. This is still to be found today, right? In some even second world countries by a certain degree. There is the clan that is deputed to education, the clan is deputed to fighting, the clan is deputed to trade. I mean, and they all kind of interact in a kind of confederal terms. So this already took the form, even in pre-Feudal times, were actually pretty large systems extensionally, and considering the number of people that inhabited on those lands. So to answer the where, of course, this was in theory for everywhere, and considering the degree of militarization of medieval Europe, I mean, this was really everybody, right? If you study, 14th century France, in certain areas the population participated to war on somewhat regular basis was even higher than Frederick II of Prussia's, in fact, military in the 18th century. So a very frequent involvement in warfare that naturally was somewhat less intense, like the modern one that tried to make it more efficient and striking harder. And so the less stable the system is, and the more we see war in the form of robbery, kind of clashes between clans, right, and raids and brigandage and things like that. And you cannot really distinguish that because war is violence at the end of the day. And to answer perhaps better this first question, of course, these at this point in history, like say late medieval times, these commoners were normally contracting, and this is essentially the political deal at the end of the day, to which the military instrument is subordinated, their military service with the higher authority, whichever it was, right? Again, it could be a lord, it could be a commune, right? And they would participate, right? And in this sense, properly in the old regime view, maintaining their own freedom, right? It was factually just an autonomy at that time, but it was based in the sense that, if there was a villager community that owed a military service by tradition because they had agreed it some time back in the day with, a neighboring city-state, well, they would just continue that negotiation, right? And they were just ad hoc measures most of the times. It wasn't, as we will see now, especially with the feudal bonds, there was some degree of standardization already by high medieval times to ask, the famous 40 days of service, after which the nobleman was not owed service anymore. That had been contracted too, but the necessities for which somebody could be summoned to go to war could be very varied. I made a video some months ago, for example, about the Western Frankish mobilization system that explains that, and it shows you how the necessities to bring this or that vassal, or even the possibility, because that was the point from the side of the king, to bring that vassal to troops into the royal army was depending on an enormous series of circumstances that eluded a kind of standardization in that regard. Also for example, in Germany, notoriously, given that the monarchy controlled just certain areas, especially in the west, in the south, it's typical for the northeastern vassals to just commute more quickly than other areas their military service in money, which is actually what I was describing in the aforementioned in this video that you commented on, because it was simply too expensive at a point even to move troops across the land, as opposed to paying, so sending money in a much cheaper way, and so allowing that degree of centralization through, in fact, some kind of tax and levy system, as you understand, for the sovereign to have this amount of wealth and keeping and bringing it together with him during the campaigns, with his treasure in his camp, his following, so that would also keep troops close to him, because it's about the motivation. Why are those troops there, right? There were constantly problems regarding, in fact, the recruitment, the levying system that was old in principle, but again had to be practically negotiated. And so the richer you were, the more wealth you could accumulate, as opposed to, some general norm that was just theoretical. The more you could effectively levy an army. Of course, even the degree by which those noblemen would pay the emperor was how powerful the emperor actually was, because in some instances they may have not even paid. So that's the issue. But of course there is also the metus hostilis, that is how convenient it is to launch that expedition, how convenient it is on the base of, I don't know, how close, simply what are the benefits that in the cost benefits ratio that can derive from invading that country, that other, right? Or some general problems were actually big, right? We don't have naturally to banalize the threat posed even just by regular invasions, etc., as properly disrupting the system altogether. And going to the following question, were they, meaning the commoners of the agricultural population? Yes, the majority, and this is normal, really, especially in the earlier times, like when, say, in late medieval times, there is a professionalization of warfare for which states become more powerful, and there is a further depauperation of the peasantry class, so that those people would be ever less likely to serve, as opposed to the mercenaries in the armies. But in general, yes, if you look at especially the larger numbers, probably the bulk, they were naturally also the least qualitative. Those were made up by the peasantry. Albeit, even about this, and especially in the times of this video, that this video talks about, we don't have to think about the peasant as the guy with the unarmored guy with pitchfork, etc. These were normally armed by the ruling, by the establishment, right? So they were also sometimes well equipped and standardly equipped by a certain degree, even with coat of mail, with pikes, with something. And interestingly enough, they also had an important degree of training of some sort, because the same communities were properly asked and imposed a military service and training, right? And the weaponry also was normally given to them, which may seem odd, because what do? You arm the masses. Well, in a sense, by a certain degree, was not necessarily a problem, meaning that the countryside, of course, could be hostile, let's say, to a main center that was the same one who provided them arms with. But if what actually the center embodied was the main authority in the land, and the collapse of it would equate to external forces kind of disrupting the countryside, and generally speaking also starting to oppress more directly these communities, well, there was no reason for them to take up arms. So it really all depends. And generally speaking, also the peasantry, the agricultural masses had an important way in the structuring of properly of the same feudal system in a consensual way. And serfs, and if serfs would their participation in foreign campaigns violate their bond to their lord, well, in theory, yes, but it wouldn't happen often. Meaning that, first of all, the difference between freemen and serfs was very loose in some moments. That is to say, who can control effectively who you are, right? Especially in high medieval times, really many people could emancipate themselves just by moving from a place to another. Right? I was making this example recently in a video about the Ostsiedlung, and seeing how, certain lay or ecclesiastical powers alike would call for people to work a certain land they owned, and said whoever comes here becomes a freeman. So surely there were serfs who were escaping their masters and going to live there, become free, and even participating to, owing a military service to the local lord. So the difference was not probably so great. Also because if you are somebody's serf, practically, chances are that you're more dependent on the constituted authority than not, right? It is more convenient for you to be still a serf in a way, and sometimes even profiting from it more than a freeman, as it would happen, especially in the High Middle Ages. In this later times, really, no, not much. There is the example of ministeriales, which I surely made the example of in the same video, that were traditionally and I talk about them because they would make up their descendants, at least, would make up the bulk of the German mercenaries that were quite famous in the first half of the 14th century. I was discussing in the video, that were traditionally, in fact, ministeriales, were administrators of lords, and they were generally serfs because they could be enfeoffed with some land without having any right to succession in it for their successor, for their children, for their heirs. So this brought to the spread of the ministeriales that became the wide majority, especially in southern Germany, of the same knights, and gradually they became even more powerful than the free knights of the noblemen. And eventually the difference, by the end of the 13th, beginning of the 14th century, on a juridical level, simply evaporated, because what was the difference, right? It was about how much actual power you really had. And I personally haven't, and of course a ministerialis, as long as it was under a lord, could not really go fight somewhere else. Also because their relation was, as I was saying before, for the serf, something very intense. That is to say, of course there were means of emancipation, but in certain countries the elite was kind of very elite, like the nobility was ever more distinguished, right, from the others. So they would have not really found any better opportunity necessarily elsewhere, right, and still maybe to remain kind of serfs juridically. And there was this loyalty, fanatic loyalty, that they owed to their lord because they hoped eventually to be rewarded. And also that was an inheritable, an inherited properly condition. So they would hope their children would have more and more of fiefs to own, so that it would become factually even more powerful, as I was saying before, the same freemen. And yes, German-speaking serfs, however, couldn't really escape. Some were treated obscenely, of course, so they would try that at least. But let's say our concept of servitude naturally stresses the idea of the oppression and also the similarity to factual slavery, etc. But in those times, slavery was really transforming more into a condition of serfdom, which is really something else. It is really much more like of a clienterly connection that has an important bond between still the contractors, because the lord also, owed something to the servant in terms of protection, right? In practice, this is evident in many ways. Also among the Mamluks in Egypt, etc. You see that it's something else between freedom and slavery, but not quite the both of them, right? Then also the mobility of the serfs was reduced in general. So why would a serf actually go at war in a foreign campaign, right? And it's not really likely to happen in the first place. Sometimes these people had become serfs exactly because they wanted to survive in conditions that were often the ones of war, and that would require a much greater, backbone, let's say, in terms of individual wealth and training and mental, let's say, mindset in order to cope with, right? So that's how also de facto some communities that were still made up of freemen that had become serfs in practice because they had preferred to cede part of their freedom in exchange for protection. And so that was again voluntary and not really liked, but still better, probably better or the best option in some ways. In this condition, this is true that, say, the most also primitive the society really is, right? In certain countries in Europe, there were lots of real serfs. In others, the concept of servitude like existed mostly just in the clientary sense. Everybody was regarded as freemen in a way. So it really depends. And generally speaking, if in the previous country type, let's say, you would have also much less mobility in general, much less social dynamism, political dynamism. So the serf would remain ever more serf, whereas in the others, instead, everything was promotional. You could go everywhere. Was a greater mobility, and maybe there some connection, say, with also far-range relations. But in this sense, you are not ever less likely to be a serf in that process, that country type, let's say. And so the second part of the question, likewise for knights and other nobility, how was participation in a mercenary company reconciled with their obligations as vassals? So at this time, late 13th, early 14th century, the traditional vassalatic bonds, in terms properly of military as far as military service was concerned, were surpassed. Meaning that, again, in high medieval times, it was this negotiated standard of 40 days of service, which was in turn the evolution, let's say, of the previous system that instead entailed a constant possible service, right? If the Lord wanted, right? In origin, both in the Roman and Germanic world, you had the king that the emperor that could really ask you to participate in at any time to a military expedition, right? Because first of all, he was supposed to have the absolute power, and in some cases, properly, the land belonged entirely to them. And this is particularly evident. I mean, in the Roman case, it's obvious because there was a demand, and the empire controlled it uniformly. Especially in the Frankish Merovingian tradition, you had properly the idea that the kingdom is in spite the people lives there, is a private possession of the king entirely. So everybody who is there is by the fact that the same monarch exists, just to follow the monarch direction. So this in practice was impossible because the coercive means of the times were ridiculous. And so the monarch came to contract the feudal obligation. But the feudal obligation within itself would be already the prepaid military service that the king gives in terms of beneficium to the guy who eventually cannot really ask for anything else in return for a military expedition because he has already received the land, and so everything, and the people who inhabit there, and so everything he needs to participate to war, and not for profit, because that's just, it should be as I was saying before, a duty and a privilege, but also, again, you're being given the land, you have all the necessary, then you owe the king that service unlimitedly. Well, in high medieval times, with the fragmentation of the empire, the fragility of public, government, this military service instead had been negotiated to 40 days normally for the feudal retinues, right? Now, consider the feudal retinues also costed a lot, so we're not talking necessarily of even such a few as a military service, because it costed really an enormity. Like if you just consider how much a horse eats and all the logistical needs, it's enormous, right? And that's part of the reason, as I was saying before, it had happened now that this service had become increasingly monetized, and hence the spread of mercenaries. So what did this mean in practice? Well, throughout all the rest of the Middle Ages and also the modern age, the feudal obligation remained. So knights and other nobility, especially the high nobility, the latter becoming effectively princes of states within the state, were all properly to mobilize their own army, right, altogether. And this was obvious, right? It was, as before, a political thermometer. Who is going to follow you in battle? I mean, think about the 100 Years' War, the split between the Armagnac and the Bourguignon in France. They're the same Valois, the same Capetian dynasty was effectively split into different factions. And so, I mean, the Burgundians were with the English, and you understand how, and they were properly a concurrent state, because Burgundy was a hell of a state in its own regard within the same France. And so this would always remain, but in practice the service was still somewhat contracted. Of course, let's say if I ask you, because you're a high nobleman, you are my relative, whatever, as a king, I ask you to go to war, and your interest, for whichever reason, is to follow me in the expedition, well, you will just do it. You will pay, because you know that that's an investment for the future. If you think that victory will bring to success and further opportunities, that's how it happens. If instead, I am kind of a bit more resistant, because I'm not really convinced, and I'm always kind of playing also a bit in the other side's field, I will need, or I'm just lazy, or I want to spend money, right? I'm tight-fisted. I will need something in return, which actually happened in both ways most of the times. Nobody does something for nothing, right? So there was an inertia that had to be surpassed, and the mercenary company could be effectively, and would be normally, made up of, would be put together by noblemen. Normally, the best examples of this are actually, think about the English indenture, for which the English nobilities, so literally the lords, the barons, start making business as mercenaries, right? And they would sell their services to the same king. So at that point, you have the overlapping of both things. I mean, nobody would really ask you the 40 days thing per se. It was more important how many troops you could bring, right? And very often this meant they had kind of some easing from the same crown, right? In part because they were same vassals, and so they had already kind of a privileged status. In part because they could be also paid further to be contracted, in fact, and providing with this retinue that made up effectively, I mean, all the men at arms were and longbowmen you see in the English army were part of this companies that were put together, however, under still a monarchic system. And so this is pretty similar to what happens in other regions. In the video we were talking obviously about Italy, where the rise of the mercenary companies is kind of more famous and important. We just were talking about it recently, but it's practically the same thing everywhere, right? If you look even at the modern age, before Louis XIV literally created a national army where everybody was levied by the state. And so, yes, the command posts were bought. I made a video about at least the 18th century French army official appointments. The rest of, say, the Habsburgs, famous, I don't know, they had, the core of their troops were actually made up of mercenaries. Think about Wallenstein, people that had factually the same power of monarchs, right, that were simply subcontracted the recruitment, say, in that case of the imperial army. And there were militias following them as well. So this system that starts appearing from the 13th to 14th century actually remains in Europe until the compaction of the national armies. There is a core of mercenary professionals, and then the militias together. And these are the armies, right? Then, yes, from the 16th century, from, say, actually the late Middle Ages, but This could be ever since some king, some lord paid for some permanent troops to be under him factually. What's the difference? Even in the early Middle Ages was factually like that. But let's say until there was a greater core of in fact, professional troops were maintained by the state, there would also be the monarchic presence there, next to the private contractors one, and the militias that were levied feudally. So the thing overlapped, right? So this is really, why would it have been important for a king to just ask for the old vassalatic duties if the system had not been remunerative enough? That's why the posts were, I don't know, the marshals of the empire in the modern age. They entailed a pension, they entailed a revenue, and these commanders would also, of course, speculate on that very often. It was a plague in fact, in pre-statal armies, the fact that even later, telling the truth, because resources are always poor, but let's say that the regiments were always under strength because the commander speculated on the supplies or the armaments, all these things. He received a commission, and he would actually spend less than that to keep the troops, just to get some money back. I made a video about the Spanish rogue, talking about that, of Guzman de Alfaraca, if I'm not wrong, is about the Spanish army in the 17th century. And so this was the normality. Let's say it's not much about what the standard feudal impositions were, but how the practical need for those troops was that made eventually the military organization, right? So at some point, states began timidly to have a greater surplus from increased statal, say, fiscal collection capacities, and so at that point it was easier just to hire whoever they found, because simply they had the money, and these mercenaries would flock to them. This had always been the case. This was true since tribal times. You had a guy who made a lot of loot in a successful raid. War bands from everywhere wanted to come to serve the guy, because they knew he would share with them greater loot than the others, and this was mixed altogether also with the ideal side of the story, that this guy owned the Imperium, had a divine connection, and so not much really changed. At a point, you can argue that the feudal system, the feudal obligations, really never worked, right? They were mostly always theoretical since the very beginning, in Carolingian times or before, right? It's much more this clientary relation that should be studied, and understanding what were the mechanisms that surely made any formality bypassed. But in general, towards the late Middle Ages, especially the 14th and 15th century, what you see is that the commoners lose ever more force, right? Probably also from a moral and material point of view, they cannot put up with the military professionals on the battlefield, and therefore they also prefer to work, to sectorialize, to specialize in some kind of socio-economical function in order to pay for that system to work. This had kind of existed already in the previous feudal times, but there is a refeudalization at the time, and the nobility too, because the nobility becomes ever more stratified. Who really commands in the country are the oligarchs, right? That they are the high nobility, and that actually share power with the monarchy that is ever stronger at an ever higher level, whereas the rest of the nobility actually suffers economically, and that's why you find also so many mercenaries, right? Many mercenaries were noblemen throughout all the medieval and modern times, right? They were properly recognized juridically as such, they had prerogatives, whatever, but they were simply too poor to say have a company on their own. They would enlist in somebody else's company, right? And so that's why you find also so many, for example, heavy cavalrymen as mercenary types at the time, late 13th, early 14th century, because most of these people actually came from a noble background. They had the means. They could purchase an armor. They knew how to fight. Importantly enough, also there were people literally emerging from nowhere, right? As peasants, as people just had learned how to fight in one way or another. Think about the Sforza. Became Dukes of Milan, but they were just peasants the generation before, and so this really depends. It had been the case actually for the European nobility altogether in the High Middle Ages, right? There was a much greater meritocracy. The Saint Charlemagne, very often to counter the power of the Frankish nobility, would elevate to that status in his retinue some people, again, that had come from nowhere but had distinguished themselves in battle. And that was an important indicator, because in theory that's what the nobility had to do. If you were successful in combat, it's because you were superior morally and more, so you deserved what you would get there. And in fact, there is all kind of an important moral system here to consider that was properly the hardcore value system that was still owned by these people intensely and deeply, right? So to make a long story short, the state began to subcontract this mercenary, because there was not much of a risk that the mercenary would become a threat, because there were so many people willing to become mercenaries that the same competition within them would dilute any kind of sort of class struggle, right? As a mercenary, you wouldn't be hired to be loyal. If you were hired by somebody who was the one who would pay the most, it would be the one you wanted to serve, right? Naturally, when also these people became powerful, they could have literally armies on their own sometimes, and so they would play more political in that regard, but still the mechanism did work towards a further hierarchization. So then the final question: did the organizers of mercenary companies negotiate contracts with recruits' lords, for example, by direction of a portion of the proceeds to said lords? Yes, in part this could happen. Even in previous feudal times, when the 40 days service was over, doesn't mean that really those vassals necessarily had exhausted their own military capacity. They could go fight somewhere else, right? Literally said, not because these rules also entailed where they had to fight, right? They had maybe to go 10 days of service or its equivalent. That's where things started getting to get monetized early, just within abroad, right? Whereas if it was in the same fief, it was for more days, of course. So all this was very complex and shaded. So the organizers of military companies could, of course, negotiate contracts with, as we've seen, other noblemen and fiefs older, right? And so these people still owed something to their overlords, and naturally they would behave accordingly to the convenience. Let's say how likely it is that your sovereign is going to ask for your military service. It's obvious that if you care being particularly loyal to your lord, you're not going to hire in a mercenary company that is going to fight eventually against the interest of that lord, at least ideally. Lots of things could change. And it's important to stress that especially by the late 13th, early 14th century, the mercenary companies really straddle a great area, right? You find them everywhere in Europe, literally from a country to another, but this is evident just from the kings. Think about John of Bohemia. He fought in the Baltic, in Poland, in Bohemia, in Germany, in Italy, in France, every freaking where. It was normal to have thieves scattered somewhere. A French lord would normally have some business in France, in Naples, in Greece, going back and forth, being hired, participating to a fight here or there, becoming lord of this place if the local communities required his services. He had always a retinue on his own. He was also noble, so he had his revenues from his fiefs. So it was a terrible life, because they were always kind of out of money, and they were doing this to make more money, right? But of course, if as a nobleman, you can engage in, let's say, not even the king or the emperor can prevent you from doing whatever you want in practice, because again, in theory, even the emperor is a first among equals, right? And so just by his own power, he should be able to guide and inspire you to do whatever he wants. But of course, it was legal for a vassal to say engage into a contract, in a relation, in a free relation with somebody who could make him fight elsewhere. It was his own responsibility publicly, and it was accepted, and it was absolutely normal, by the way. And of course, that had a political meaning, and so depending on that, it could be more or less problematic for him and his feudal bond, but still, the situation was enormously more complicated than we usually think. It was an extremely dynamic world, especially the time of that video. People traveled everywhere, especially these people, and always fighting and winning a great reputation. I mean, think about even tournaments. These are the times also, especially during the second half of the 14th to 15th century, which war was ever more, let's say more professionally organized from the top. So even this figure of the knight in rent, that is actually just an impoverished nobleman that at least makes money with tournaments, is the proof of how, of course, the older feudal nobility was being kind of ever less a protagonist on the field. It was just, recognize his own prerogatives, but say in practice war was changing. Armies were ever larger, were made up in an ever more engineered way, also in doctrinal terms, with important assets to be invested also in our firearms, artillery, so things that really didn't belong much to the world of the feudal, saying to belong to feudality, but were something ever more modern and subtle, and so things would change. And there are interesting reads on this. With Zinga, the Autumn of the Middle Ages, it's a classic, but it's probably not even the best thing, of course, you can read. I mean, just for those who want to begin. But we will talk more about this kind of context in this passage. I also made a video last year, was between Bayard and Ariosto, that documented that kind of decline of knighthood and chivalry in perspective, and so also a bit the single events of this nobleman and how in front of the war that was changing, which they were ever less central in it, because this was at the end the point, right? Unless they became, in fact, they passed from individual warriors to kind of statesmen that were more organizers and top commanders than actual fighters. But that was the trend, right? That also kings eventually would undergo, because it was the necessity. How do you organize the system otherwise? So I would like to thank the user for the questions, because they are very interesting, and I'm always glad to answer these, because I don't know how good I am at it, but I care about providing with a plastic understanding of what reality was, and I realized that it's not easy, because actually everything was much simpler than we think. It's like our modern mindset that fixates very often on definitions, categories, mechanisms, but the answer is always think about it humanly. Think about what you would do and how and why, right? What are the motivation? And again, that's not easy, in fact, and that's why I'm making all these videos, but the questions were very interesting, and I really appreciate. So for today, stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.